Welcome to this journey through one of the most audacious acts of individual courage in Cold War history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time when you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these stories reach you. On May 28, 1987, at exactly 7:18 p.m. Moscow time, Soviet police officer Dmitry Volkov was standing guard near St. Basil's Cathedral when he heard an engine, not a car engine, not a helicopter, an airplane engine, getting louder, getting closer. He looked up and saw something impossible. A small, white and blue Cessna 172 was descending toward Red Square, the kind of plane teenagers learn to fly in, coming straight toward him, toward the Kremlin, toward the heart of the Soviet Union. Dmitry grabbed his radio. His hands were shaking. Unidentified aircraft landing Red Square. Repeat, aircraft is landing in Red Square. The radio crackled back. That is impossible. Our air defense would have destroyed it. Dmitry looked up again. The plane was 50 meters above him. 40 meters. 30. He could see the pilot through the windscreen. A young man. Barely more than a boy. Wearing wire-frame glasses. And he was smiling. Dmitry drew his pistol. But what was he supposed to do? Shoot down an aircraft that was already landing. He watched, helpless, as a 19-year-old German student landed an airplane next to the Kremlin and humiliated the most powerful military in the world. 5 hours earlier, that same student had been sitting in a rental office at Helsinki-Malmi Airport in Finland. His name was Mathias Rust. He was 19 years old. He had 50 hours of total flight experience, and he was about to do something that NATO had spent 40 years preparing for and never dared attempt. He was going to penetrate Soviet airspace and live to tell about it. But before we understand how Mathias pulled off the impossible, we need to understand why. 3 months before this moment, Mathias had been watching television in his family apartment in Hamburg, Germany. The evening news showed footage of Soviet and American negotiators at a peace summit in Geneva. They sat across from each other at a conference table. They argued. They postured. They accused. They accomplished nothing. The Cold War continued. The arms race continued. The threat of nuclear annihilation continued. Mathias turned to his father. Someone should just fly to Moscow and talk to Gorbachev directly. Cut through all the bureaucracy. Talk to him person to person. Maybe that would actually accomplish something. His father laughed. You cannot just fly to Moscow, Mathias. The Soviets have the best air defense system in the world. They would shoot you down before you got within 100 kilometers of the border. Mathias thought about that. And then he asked a question that would change his life. What if they did not? What if I flew so low and so slow that their radar could not track me properly? What if I flew in a tiny plane that nobody would take seriously? What if I made it to Moscow before they figured out what to do about me? His father thought Mathias was joking. Mathias was not joking. Over the next 3 months, Mathias studied Soviet air defense. He read everything he could find about radar coverage. He learned about the minimum detection altitudes for Soviet radar systems. He calculated fuel consumption for a flight from Finland to Moscow. He planned every detail of a route that everyone said was impossible. And he told absolutely no one what he was planning. On May 28, 1987, at 12:30 p.m., Mathias walked into the Flight Services office at Helsinki-Malmi Airport. He asked to rent a Cessna 172 for a few hours. The clerk asked where he planned to fly. Mathias said, Stockholm. Round trip. Standard, recreational flight. The clerk checked Mathias's pilot license. Valid. Checked his rental history. No problems. She cleared him for departure and handed him the keys. Mathias loaded his flight bag into the Cessna. Inside were maps of the Soviet Union, a compass, a water bottle, and one ham sandwich. That was it. No weapons, no communication jamming equipment, no stealth technology, just maps, water, and a sandwich. The minimalist toolkit of a teenager who was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Maybe both. He climbed into the cockpit. The Cessna 172 is not an impressive aircraft. It weighs 1,000 kilograms. It has a maximum speed of 150 kilometers per hour. Its range is about 800 kilometers. It costs less than most cars. It is designed for flight training and short recreational trips. It is absolutely not designed to penetrate the airspace of a nuclear superpower. But Mathias did not need an impressive aircraft. He needed an aircraft so small and so slow that Soviet air defense would not know how to respond to it. The Cessna 172 was perfect. He started the engine. The single propeller began to turn. He taxied to the runway. He radioed the tower and requested clearance for departure to Stockholm. The tower cleared him. He pushed the throttle forward. The Cessna accelerated down the runway. At 70 kilometers per hour, he pulled back on the control yoke. The nose lifted. The wheels left the ground. And Mathias Rust was airborne on a flight that would either make him famous or get him killed. There would be no middle ground. For the first 15 minutes, everything went according to the flight plan he had filed. He flew west toward Stockholm. He climbed to 3,000 meters. He maintained radio contact with Helsinki air traffic control. He acted like a normal pilot on a normal recreational flight doing normal things. But at exactly 1 p.m., Mathias made a decision that would change history. He turned east, toward the Soviet Union. Helsinki air traffic control noticed immediately. They radioed him, called his tail number, asked why he had deviated from his filed flight plan. Mathias did not respond. They called again. No response. They assumed radio failure. Standard procedure for radio failure was to notify the military and let them track the aircraft on radar. The Finnish Air Force tracked Mathias as he flew across the Gulf of Finland. They watched him approach Soviet airspace, and then they stopped tracking. Because once Mathias crossed into Soviet territory, he became someone else's problem. He became the Soviet Union's problem. At 2:15 p.m., Mathias crossed the Soviet border near the Estonian coast. A Soviet radar station detected him within 30 seconds. Unidentified aircraft, no transponder code, no radio contact, low altitude, heading southwest. The radar operator, a young conscript named Alexei, stared at his screen. He had been trained for exactly this scenario. Unidentified aircraft meant potential threat. Potential threat meant alert the commander immediately. Alexei picked up the phone. His commander answered. Alexei reported the contact. The commander asked about the aircraft's speed and altitude. Alexei read the data. 150 kilometers per hour. Altitude 100 meters. There was a long pause. The commander asked Alexei to repeat those numbers. Alexei repeated them. Another pause. Then the commander said something Alexei did not expect. Are you certain this is not a malfunction in the radar system? Alexei looked at his screen again. The contact was solid. It was definitely real. But he understood why his commander was skeptical. 150 kilometers per hour was incredibly slow for any military aircraft, and 100 meters was dangerously low. No sane pilot would fly that low over unfamiliar terrain. The commander told Alexei to continue monitoring and report if the contact maintained course. Then he hung up. Alexei kept watching. The contact maintained course. It kept flying southwest, toward Leningrad, toward Moscow. Alexei picked up the phone again. His commander sounded annoyed. He told Alexei they would scramble fighters to investigate. But there was skepticism in his voice. He did not believe this was a real threat. At 2:30 p.m., 2 MiG-23 fighters took off from an air base near the Estonian coast. These were not ordinary aircraft. The MiG-23 was one of the Soviet Union's frontline fighters. Top speed Mach 2.3. Armed with air-to-air missiles and a 23mm cannon. Piloted by career military aviators who had trained for years to intercept NATO bombers. They climbed to 5,000 meters and turned toward the intercept coordinates. The lead pilot was Major Viktor Orlov. He had flown intercept missions for 12 years. He had faced NATO reconnaissance aircraft over the Baltic Sea dozens of times. He knew his job. Identify the target. Assess the threat. If the target was hostile, destroy it. Simple. Clear. Except that today, nothing would be simple. The radar controller guided the MiGs toward Mathias's position. 5 kilometers out. 3 kilometers. 1 kilometer. Visual contact should be imminent. But Victor saw nothing. He was flying at 5,000 meters looking down at forests and lakes. The radar said the target should be directly below him. But all Victor could see was terrain. The problem was that Mathias was flying at 100 meters. That is the height of a 30-story building. At that altitude, a small white airplane becomes nearly invisible against a background of trees and water. And Victor was flying at 800 kilometers per hour. The human eye cannot spot a slow-moving target when you are moving that fast. It is physiologically impossible. Victor made 3 passes over the area. He saw nothing. He radioed back to base. No visual contact. Target too small or too low, returning to base due to fuel constraints. The MiGs turned back. Their mission was a failure. Inside his Cessna, Mathias had watched the MiGs pass overhead. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the control yoke. His heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape. His breath came in short gasps. He had read about MiG-23s. He knew what they were capable of. Mach 2.3. Heat-seeking missiles. A cannon that could tear his Cessna apart in seconds. If those pilots had seen him, he would be dead right now. Blown out of the sky before he even heard the missile launch. But they had not seen him. They had flown directly overhead and missed him completely. Mathias realized something in that moment. He was not brave. He was absolutely terrified. Every second of this flight was pure terror. His hands were shaking. His stomach was churning. Part of his brain was screaming at him to turn around, to fly back to Finland, to abandon this insane plan before he got himself killed. But Mathias kept flying east, because he also realized something else. He had crossed the border. There was no turning back now. If he tried to return to Finland, the Soviets would shoot him down for certain. They would have time to scramble more fighters, time to coordinate an effective intercept. His only chance of survival was to keep going forward, to make it to Moscow, to land before they could stop him, to force a confrontation that would make killing him politically impossible. So Mathias kept flying. handshaking, heart pounding, terror and determination fighting for control of his mind. He descended to 90 meters, then 80, as low as he dared without risking hitting trees or power lines. The lower he flew, the harder he was to detect, the harder he was to see, the harder he was to stop. At 3 p.m., a different Soviet radar station detected Mathias. The same confusion followed. Slow-moving target. Very low altitude. What is it? Is it one of ours? Should we scramble fighters? By the time the station decided to alert military command, Mathias had already passed out of their coverage area. He was gone, a ghost on the radar, there 1 minute, vanished the next. This happened again at 3:45 p.m., and again at 4:20 p.m., and again at 4:50 p.m. 7 different radar stations detected Mathias during his 5-hour flight. 7 times, confusion and bureaucracy prevented an effective response. At one station, the commander looked at the speed and altitude data and decided it must be a flock of birds. At another station, the operator assumed it was a Soviet training aircraft with a malfunctioning transponder. At a third station, the commander called his superior officer to ask for guidance. His superior officer was in a meeting. By the time the superior officer called back, Mathias was long gone. At 4:30 p.m., Senior Lieutenant Yuri Petrov was sitting at his radar console at a station outside Moscow. He had been on duty for 8 hours. He was tired, bored, ready for his shift to end. And then he saw it. A slow, moving contact. Altitude 90 meters. Speed 150 kilometers per hour. Heading straight for Moscow. Yuri stared at the screen. This was exactly the kind of contact he was supposed to report immediately. But Yuri hesitated. He had been reprimanded twice in the past year for reporting false alarms. Once it had been a weather balloon that somehow appeared on his radar. Once it had been a flock of geese flying in perfect formation. His commander had screamed at him both times, told him he was wasting everyone's time, told him if he filed one more false report, he would be transferred to a radar station in Siberia, where nobody would have to deal with his incompetence. Yuri looked at the contact again. It was probably nothing. Probably another weather balloon. Probably another embarrassing mistake. He did not want to be screamed at again. He did not want to be transferred to Siberia. He picked up a pen, wrote a note in his logbook. Unidentified target, low altitude, assessed as non-threat. And he went back to monitoring his sector. The contact on his screen kept moving toward Moscow. Yuri kept watching it. He told himself he had made the right decision. He told himself it was nothing. But part of him wondered, what if it was not nothing? What if he had just made the biggest mistake of his career? He would find out soon enough. At 6:30 p.m., Mathias saw Moscow on the horizon. He had been flying for over 5 hours. His back ached, his arms ached, his eyes burned from staring at instruments and scanning for fighters. He was exhausted, but he had made it. He had flown 430 kilometers through Soviet airspace, through the most sophisticated air defense system in the world. And somehow, he was still alive. Moscow air defense detected him immediately. Unlike the rural radar stations, Moscow did not hesitate. Moscow scrambled fighters. Moscow prepared surface-to-air missiles. Moscow was the capital of the Soviet Union, and it did not make mistakes. Except that by the time Moscow reacted, Mathias was already inside the outer defense ring. He was so low that he kept disappearing from radar behind buildings and terrain. The fighters scrambled, but they could not find him. The missiles prepared to launch. but Mathias was flying below their minimum engagement altitude. At 7 p.m., Mathias circled the Kremlin. He was looking for a place to land. He could see Red Square below, tourists walking, police officers standing guard. He had only minutes before Moscow figured out how to stop him. He needed to land immediately. Red Square was not designed for aircraft, but it was his only option. He lined up his approach, reduced power, lowered flaps. The Cessna descended, and Dmitry Volkov, standing guard near St. Basil's Cathedral, looked up and saw the impossible happening right in front of his eyes. At 7:20 p.m. on May 28, 1987, Mathias Rust did something no pilot had ever done before, and no pilot would ever do again. He landed a Cessna 172 on Red Square in Moscow, right next to the Kremlin, in front of hundreds of witnesses. And for exactly 47 seconds before the KGB arrived, tourists thought it was part of a show. The landing was not smooth. Red Square is paved with cobblestones, large irregular cobblestones that were laid down in the 1500s and were never designed for aircraft. When the Cessna's wheels touched down, the plane bounced. Hard. Mathias fought to keep the wings level. The nose wanted to pitch forward. The tail wanted to swing sideways. Every instinct screamed at him to add power and abort the landing. But there was nowhere to go. Moscow air defense was fully alert now. If he took off again, they would shoot him down within seconds. So Mathias held the yoke steady. He kept the wings level. He let the Cessna bounce twice more and then settle onto the cobblestones. The plane rolled forward 50 meters, 40 meters, 30. He was heading straight toward the wall of the Kremlin. He pressed hard on the brakes. The wheels locked. The plane skidded on the smooth stones, 20 meters from the Kremlin wall, 15 meters, 10. The Cessna finally stopped 8 meters from the wall, close enough that Mathias could see the individual bricks. He sat in the cockpit breathing hard. His hands were still gripping the yoke so tightly that his knuckles were white. His heart was hammering. He had done it. He had actually done it. He had flown from Finland to Moscow. He had penetrated Soviet airspace. He had landed in Red Square. He was alive. And then he looked out the window and saw the faces. Tourists were everywhere. German tourists, French tourists, Japanese tourists, dozens of them standing in Red Square taking photographs of St. Basil's Cathedral and the Kremlin. And now they were all staring at Mathias's airplane. Some of them were smiling, some were laughing, some were pointing and talking excitedly to each other. One man with a large camera was already taking photographs. They thought this was entertainment. They thought the Soviet government had arranged some kind of aviation demonstration. A young pilot performing stunts for the tourists. Mathias opened the cockpit door and stepped out onto the cobblestones. His legs were shaking. He had been sitting in a cramped cockpit for 5.5 hours, and his muscles were not cooperating. He steadied himself against the wing of the Cessna. A group of tourists approached him. They were smiling, speaking in German, asking if he was part of an air show, asking if they could take photographs with him and the airplane. Mathias did not know what to say. He had prepared for many possible scenarios. He had prepared for being shot down. He had prepared for being arrested immediately upon landing. He had prepared for Soviet military surrounding him with weapons. He had not prepared for tourists asking for his autograph. But that is exactly what was happening. A middle-aged German woman handed him a small notebook and a pen. She asked him to sign it. Mathias signed it. More tourists approached, more requests for autographs and photographs. For 47 seconds, Mathias Rust stood next to his airplane in Red Square, signing autographs like he was a celebrity. And then the KGB arrived. 6 men in dark suits came running across Red Square. They were not subtle. They were not trying to blend in. They were KGB officers, and everyone knew it. The tourists saw them coming and scattered. The smiles disappeared. The cameras were put away. The air show fantasy evaporated in an instant. Reality returned. The lead KGB officer reached Mathias first. He grabbed Mathias by the arm, spoke to him in Russian. Mathias did not speak Russian. He spoke German and English. The KGB officer switched to broken English. "You are under arrest. You do not move. You do not speak. You do not do anything." The other 5 officers surrounded Mathias. 2 of them drew pistols. They were not pointing them at Mathias yet. But the message was clear. If Mathias tried to run, they would shoot him. More officials arrived. Soviet police officers, military personnel, men in civilian clothes who were clearly intelligence officers. Within 2 minutes of landing, Mathias was surrounded by at least 20 people. Some of them were shouting. Some were talking urgently into radios. Some were just staring at the airplane like they could not believe what they were seeing. An airplane in Red Square, next to the Kremlin. This was impossible. And yet here it was. Physical proof of a security failure so massive that nobody knew how to process it. A Soviet Army colonel pushed through the crowd. He looked at Mathias, looked at the airplane, looked back at Mathias. Then he asked in English, "How did you get here?" Mathias said, "I flew." The colonel said, "I can see that. I am asking how you flew here. How did you cross our border? How did you evade our air defense? How did you penetrate Moscow airspace without being shot down?" Mathias did not answer. He had been told by his father before he left Hamburg to say nothing if he was arrested. Give them your name. Give them your nationality. Give them nothing else. Let them figure out the rest. So Mathias said, "My name is Mathias Rust. I am a German citizen. I want to speak to Mikhail Gorbachev." The colonel stared at him. "You want to what?" "I want to speak to Mikhail Gorbachev. I came here to talk to him about peace." The colonel looked at the KGB officers. The KGB officers looked at each other. Nobody knew what to say. This was not a scenario anyone had trained for. A 19-year-old German student flying a tiny airplane to Moscow to request a meeting with the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It was absurd. It was insane. It was completely outside the bounds of normal espionage or military protocol. And yet it had happened. The KGB officers handcuffed Mathias. They walked him to a waiting car. He looked back once at his Cessna sitting on the cobblestones of Red Square. White and blue paint. Registration number Delta Echo Charlie Charlie India. The little airplane that had somehow accomplished what NATO's most advanced aircraft could not. It had penetrated Soviet airspace and reached the heart of Moscow. As Mathias was pushed into the back seat of the KGB car, he wondered if he would ever see that airplane again. He would not. The Cessna would be confiscated, disassembled, studied, and eventually destroyed. But Mathias did not know that yet. The car drove away from Red Square. Mathias sat in the back seat between 2 KGB officers. Neither of them spoke. They drove through Moscow streets, past apartment buildings and shops and pedestrians who had no idea what had just happened. The car turned into a gated compound, stopped at a checkpoint. Armed guards checked documents. The gate opened. They drove inside. This was Lefortovo prison. Mathias did not know the name yet, but he would learn it soon enough. Lefortovo was where the KGB held prisoners they wanted to interrogate thoroughly. It was not a regular prison. It was an interrogation facility, the kind of place where people went in and sometimes did not come out. The car stopped. The KGB officers pulled Mathias out. They walked him into a building, down a corridor, through multiple security doors. Finally, they reached a small room. No windows, one metal table, two metal chairs, a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The classic interrogation room that looked exactly like every movie interrogation room Mathias had ever seen, except this was real. This was actually happening to him. One of the KGB officers pointed at a chair. Mathias sat. The officers left. The door closed. Mathias heard it lock from the outside. And then he was alone. He sat in that room for 3 hours. Nobody came. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody brought him food or water. He just sat there in silence, wondering what was going to happen next. His mind raced. He thought about his parents in Hamburg. They had no idea where he was. They thought he was flying to Stockholm. They probably thought he was already back by now. They had no idea their son was sitting in a KGB interrogation room in Moscow, facing charges that could put him in a Soviet labor camp for 10 years or more. Mathias thought about what he had done. The full weight of it was starting to sink in. He had violated Soviet airspace. He had embarrassed the Soviet military. He had landed an unauthorized aircraft next to the Kremlin. In the Soviet Union, these were not minor infractions. These were serious crimes. And the Soviet Union did not have a reputation for being gentle with foreign nationals who committed serious crimes on their territory. But Mathias also thought about why he had done this. He had wanted to make a statement. He had wanted to prove that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things if they had the courage to try. He had wanted to show that the barriers between East and West were not as impenetrable as everyone believed. He had wanted to start a conversation about peace. Whether the Soviet government would see it that way remained to be seen. At 10:30 p.m., the door opened. A man walked in. He was older than the KGB officers who had arrested Mathias. 50s, maybe. Gray hair, expensive suit. He carried a leather briefcase. He sat down across from Mathias and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Finally, he said in perfect English, "Do you understand the magnitude of what you have done?" Mathias said, "I wanted to talk to Gorbachev about peace." The man said, "You violated Soviet airspace? You flew an unauthorized aircraft into restricted zones. You landed next to the Kremlin. You could have been carrying weapons. You could have been carrying explosives. You could have been attempting to assassinate government officials. Do you understand that under Soviet law, we have every right to execute you for what you have done?" Mathias felt his stomach drop. He had known he was taking a risk. But hearing someone say the word execute out loud made it real in a way it had not been before. He looked at the man across from him and tried to keep his voice steady. "I was not carrying weapons. I was not carrying explosives. I was carrying maps and a ham sandwich. You can search my airplane. You can search me. I came here to talk. Nothing else." The man opened his briefcase and pulled out a file. He opened it. Inside were photographs. Photographs of Mathias's Cessna on radar screens. Photographs of MiG fighters in flight. Documents with timestamps and coordinates. The man said, "We tracked you from the moment you crossed our border. We scrambled fighters 3 times. We had multiple opportunities to shoot you down. Do you know why we did not? Mathias said, because you did not know what to do about me. The man smiled. It was not a friendly smile. He said, that is correct. You were too slow and too low for our systems to handle effectively. You exploited a weakness in our air defense that we did not know existed. Congratulations! You have just taught the Soviet military a very expensive lesson. And now you are going to pay for that lesson with years of your life. While Mathias Rust sat in his interrogation cell, wondering if he would ever see Germany again, the Soviet government was experiencing the worst political crisis of the entire Cold War. Because at exactly 7:30 p.m. on May 28, 1987, the telephone on Mikhail Gorbachev's desk rang, and the voice on the other end told him something that made his blood run cold. General Secretary, a German teenager, just landed an airplane in Red Square. Gorbachev did not believe it. He thought someone was playing a joke, a very bad joke. He demanded to know who he was speaking to. The voice identified itself as Colonel General Ivan Tretyak, Deputy Commander of Moscow Air Defense. He was not joking. He was reporting a catastrophic security breach. An unauthorized aircraft had penetrated Soviet airspace, flown 430 kilometers across Soviet territory, and landed next to the Kremlin, in front of hundreds of witnesses, and Moscow air defense had failed to stop it. Gorbachev hung up the phone. He sat at his desk in silence for a full minute, processing what he had just been told. Then he picked up the phone again and started making calls. Within 30 minutes, every senior official in the Soviet government knew what had happened. Within an hour, emergency meetings were being convened. Within 2 hours, Gorbachev was sitting in a secure conference room at the Kremlin, surrounded by the most powerful men in the Soviet Union. And he was absolutely furious. The meeting started with General Secretary Gorbachev asking one simple question. How did this happen? The room fell silent. Nobody wanted to be the first to speak. Nobody wanted to be the person who had to explain this disaster. Finally, Defense Minister Sergei Sokolov cleared his throat. General Secretary, we are still investigating the details, but preliminary reports suggest the aircraft flew at extremely low altitude using terrain and radar gaps to avoid detection. Our air defense protocols are designed for high-altitude bombers and missiles. This type of small, slow-moving target at low altitude was outside our standard response parameters. Gorbachev stared at him. Outside our standard response parameters. That is your explanation? A teenager in a training aircraft penetrated our airspace, and you are telling me it was outside your parameters. Sokolov said, we scrambled interceptors 3 times. The target was too small and too low for effective visual acquisition. Gorbachev said, then why did you not shoot it down? You have surface-to-air missiles. You have radar-guided systems. Why did you not destroy this aircraft before it reached Moscow? Sokolov hesitated. General Secretary, there were concerns about positive identification. We did not want to risk shooting down a civilian aircraft or one of our own training planes that had malfunctioned. The incident with Korean Airlines 0074 years ago created significant international complications. We wanted to avoid a similar situation. Gorbachev stood up. His voice was quiet, deadly quiet. So you are telling me that our air defense system, the system we have spent billions of rubles to build, the system we have told the Soviet people is impenetrable, the system that is supposed to protect us from NATO bombers carrying nuclear weapons, you are telling me this system cannot handle one unarmed teenager in a Cessna? Is that what you are telling me? Nobody answered. The silence in the room was absolute. Every man at that table understood what was happening. This was not just a security failure. This was a political disaster, and someone was going to pay for it. Gorbachev continued speaking. His voice was still quiet, but there was steel in it now. Do you understand what this means? Tomorrow morning, every newspaper in the West is going to run this story. German student lands in Red Square. Soviet air defense helpless to stop him. Do you understand how this makes us look? Do you understand the propaganda value this gives to our enemies? They have been saying for years that our military is incompetent, that our systems are outdated, that our leadership is weak, and you have just handed them proof. KGB Chairman Viktor Chebrikov spoke up. General Secretary, we can control the domestic narrative. We can minimize press coverage inside the Soviet Union. The Western media will report this story regardless. But we can prevent it from becoming a major embarrassment domestically. Gorbachev turned to him. You think we can hide this? There were hundreds of tourists in Red Square when this happened. German tourists, French tourists, Japanese tourists. They all saw it. They all took photographs. By tomorrow, those photographs will be in every newspaper in Europe and America. You think we can hide that? Chebrikov said nothing. He understood the point. There was no hiding this. The story was already out. The damage was done. The only question now was how to respond. Gorbachev sat back down. He looked around the table at the faces of the men who were supposed to be the best military and intelligence minds in the Soviet Union. And he saw what they really were. Bureaucrats, careerists, men who had spent so much time following rules and avoiding responsibility that they had forgotten how to actually protect their country. He made a decision in that moment, a decision that would shake the Soviet military to its core. Defense Minister Sokolov, you are dismissed from your position effective immediately. General Koldenov, Commander of Air Defense Forces, you are dismissed. Colonel General Tretyak, you are dismissed. I want a complete review of every officer involved in this failure. Anyone who had an opportunity to stop this aircraft and failed to act will be removed from their position. I want this done within 1 week. The room erupted. Protests, objections, attempts to explain. Gorbachev raised his hand, and they all fell silent. This is not a debate. This is an order. You have failed the Soviet people. You have embarrassed our military. You have given our enemies a propaganda victory that will take years to overcome, and there will be consequences. This meeting is over. The officials filed out of the conference room in shocked silence. Gorbachev remained seated. He was thinking about the bigger picture now. This was not just about one flight by one teenager. This was about systemic failures in the Soviet military. This was about a command structure so rigid and bureaucratic that it could not adapt to unexpected situations. This was about officers who were more afraid of making mistakes than they were committed to defending their country. And if the Soviet military could not stop one unarmed teenager, how could it possibly defend against a real attack? Gorbachev had been pushing for military reforms since becoming General Secretary in 1985. He had been trying to modernize Soviet forces, trying to reduce bureaucracy, trying to improve efficiency. But he had faced resistance at every level. Senior officers did not want change. They liked the old system. It was comfortable. It was predictable. And now that old system had failed spectacularly. Mathias Rust had just given Gorbachev the political ammunition he needed to force through changes that the military establishment had been blocking for 2 years. While Gorbachev was planning his military purge, the world was learning about Mathias Rust's flight. The first news reports hit Western media at approximately 10 p.m. Moscow time. A German student has landed an airplane in Moscow's Red Square. Initial reports were sketchy. Nobody knew many details. But the basic story was enough. A civilian had penetrated Soviet airspace and reached the Kremlin. The implications were staggering. In Washington, D.C., President Ronald Reagan was briefed on the situation at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. He listened to the briefing in silence. Then he asked his advisors, "Can someone please explain to me how a kid in a rented airplane did what our Air Force has been planning to do for 40 years?" His advisors had no good answer. They were as shocked as everyone else. In Bonn, West Germany, Chancellor Helmut Kohl received the news with mixed emotions. On one hand, this was a public relations disaster for the Soviet Union. It demonstrated weaknesses in Soviet air defense that NATO had suspected, but never confirmed. On the other hand, Mathias Rust was a German citizen. He was now in Soviet custody, facing serious charges, and Kohl would have to negotiate for his release. That was not going to be easy. In London, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher called the incident absolutely extraordinary. In Paris, French President François Mitterrand said it raised serious questions about Soviet military competence. In Tokyo, Japanese officials expressed concern for the safety of tourists visiting the Soviet Union. Every Western leader saw the propaganda value immediately, the mighty Soviet military brought down by a teenager. It was almost too good to be true. Soviet media handled the story very differently. For the first 24 hours, there was complete silence. Soviet television did not mention it. Soviet newspapers did not print it. The Soviet government was trying to figure out how to spin this disaster into something less embarrassing. But the Western media had already made that impossible. Radio Free Europe was broadcasting the story into the Soviet Union. The BBC was covering it extensively. Soviet citizens who listened to foreign radio knew what had happened, even if their own government would not tell them. Finally, on May 29th, Soviet media acknowledged the incident. The coverage was brief and downplayed the significance. A small aircraft, piloted by a West German citizen, violated Soviet airspace and made an unauthorized landing in Moscow. The pilot has been detained and is being questioned. Appropriate measures are being taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. That was it. No details about how far Mathias had flown. No mention of the multiple failures to intercept him. No acknowledgement of how embarrassing this was. But Soviet citizens were not stupid. They could read between the lines. They could hear what was being said on foreign radio. They understood what had really happened. Their invincible air defense system had been defeated by a teenager. Their mighty military had been humiliated, and their government was lying to them about it. For many Soviet citizens, this was a moment of clarity. If the government was lying about this, what else were they lying about? On May 30th, Gorbachev made good on his threat. Defense Minister Sergei Sokolov was formally dismissed. He had held the position for less than 3 years. He was replaced by General Dmitry Yazov, a reform-minded officer who Gorbachev believed would be more responsive to civilian control. Air Defense Commander Alexander Koldanov was also dismissed after a 40-year military career. He was essentially forced into retirement in disgrace. Over the next week, more than 300 officers involved in air defense were either dismissed, demoted, or transferred to less important positions. It was the largest purge of Soviet military leadership since Stalin. And it sent a clear message. Failure would not be tolerated. Incompetence would not be excused. The old ways were over. The purge had consequences that went far beyond just the individuals involved. It weakened the political power of the Soviet military establishment. It gave Gorbachev more control over military policy. And it accelerated reforms that would eventually contribute to the end of the Cold War. Mathias Rust had not just embarrassed the Soviet military. He had fundamentally changed the power dynamics within the Soviet government. Whether he understood that at the time is unclear, but sitting in his cell at Lefortovo prison, Mathias Rust had already done more to weaken Soviet military power than most NATO operations had accomplished in decades. For 432 days, Mathias Rust lived in a cell at Lefortovo prison. 432 days of interrogations, 432 days of uncertainty, 432 days wondering if he would ever see Germany again. And during those 432 days, the world outside his cell was fighting over what should happen to the teenager who had embarrassed the Soviet Union. The interrogations started on May 29th, the day after his arrest. KGB officers questioned Mathias for 8 hours straight. They wanted to know everything. Who had helped him plan the flight? Which intelligence agencies had he been working with? What secret equipment had been installed in his aircraft? Mathias gave them the same answers every time. Nobody helped me. I was not working for any intelligence agency. There was no secret equipment. I planned this myself because I wanted to talk to Gorbachev about peace. The KGB officers did not believe him. They could not believe him. In their worldview, individuals did not act alone. There were always handlers, always connections, always someone pulling the strings. A 19-year-old student could not possibly have penetrated Soviet airspace without help from Western intelligence. So they kept questioning him, kept pushing, kept trying to find the conspiracy that they were certain must exist. But there was no conspiracy. Mathias had acted alone. He had planned everything himself. He had used publicly available maps and information about Soviet air defense that anyone could find in aviation magazines. There were no secret techniques, no classified intelligence. Just a teenager with a crazy idea and enough determination to actually try it. After 2 weeks of interrogation, the KGB finally accepted that Mathias was telling the truth. He was not a spy. He was not working for NATO. He was just an idealistic kid who had done something incredibly stupid and incredibly dangerous because he genuinely believed it might help promote peace. The KGB officers did not know what to do with that information. Their entire training was about dealing with spies and saboteurs. They had no framework for dealing with a well-meaning idiot. On August 4th, 1987, Mathias Rust went on trial in Moscow. The trial was held at the Supreme Court of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. It was supposed to be a show trial, a public demonstration of Soviet justice, a way for the government to reassure the Soviet people that the teenager who had violated their airspace was being properly punished. But the trial did not go according to plan. Mathias was charged with violating Soviet airspace, illegally entering the Soviet Union, and hooliganism. The hooliganism charge was particularly Soviet. It was a catch-all offense that basically meant you had done something that embarrassed the state. The prosecution asked for a sentence of 10 years in a labor camp. They argued that Mathias's actions had compromised Soviet security and could have resulted in a military conflict. They said he needed to be punished severely to deter others from attempting similar stunts. Mathias's defense attorney was assigned by the Soviet government. His name was Viktor Balakin. He was not supposed to mount an aggressive defense. He was supposed to go through the motions and let the court convict Mathias according to the script. But Balakin actually believed in his client. He believed that Mathias's motivations were genuine, and he argued passionately for leniency. Balakin told the court that Mathias was not a criminal. He was a naive young man who had made a mistake. Yes, he had violated Soviet airspace. Yes, he had landed illegally in Moscow. But he had not been carrying weapons. He had not been trying to harm anyone. He had been trying to promote peace. Did that deserve 10 years in a labor camp? Did the Soviet Union really want to send a message to the world that it punished people who advocated for peace? The prosecution objected. The judge sustained the objection. But Balakin had made his point. International media were covering the trial. Reporters from Germany, France, Britain, and America were in the courtroom. They wrote down everything Balakin said. And the next day, newspapers around the world ran headlines about the teenager who went to prison for wanting peace. The trial lasted 3 days. On August 7th, the verdict was announced. Guilty on all charges. Sentence, 4 years in a general regime labor camp. It was less than the prosecution had asked for, but still a significant punishment. Mathias was 19 years old. He would be 23 by the time he was released. 4 years of his youth gone, 4 years in a Soviet prison. All because he had wanted to build a bridge between East and West. After the trial, Mathias was transferred to a labor camp in the Kaluga region, about 100 kilometers southwest of Moscow. Life in the camp was hard. Mathias worked in a furniture factory making chairs and tables. He woke at 6 a.m., worked until 6 p.m., ate basic meals of bread, soup, and occasional meat. Slept in a barracks with 40 other prisoners. It was not the brutal gulag of Stalin's era. Gorbachev's reforms had made labor camps somewhat more humane. But it was still prison, still punishment, still isolation from everything Mathias had known. His parents were allowed to visit once every 2 months. They had to apply for Soviet visas, travel to Moscow, take a bus to the labor camp, sit across from their son in a monitored visiting room for 1 hour, then leave. His mother cried every time. His father stayed strong during the visits, but broke down afterwards. They had spent months not knowing if their son was alive. Now they knew he was alive, but locked away, where they could barely reach him. International pressure for Mathias's release started almost immediately after his conviction. The West German government made formal requests to Soviet authorities. They argued that 4 years was excessive for what was essentially a navigation error. They said Mathias had not intended harm. They asked for his sentence to be commuted and for him to be expelled from the Soviet Union. The Soviet government refused. They said Mathias had been convicted in a fair trial. He had received appropriate punishment. The sentence would stand. But behind the scenes, negotiations were happening. West Germany wanted Mathias back. The Soviet Union wanted something in return. What followed was months of diplomatic horse trading. Gorbachev understood that keeping Mathias in prison had limited value. The propaganda damage was already done. The story was already told. Releasing Mathias would not undo the embarrassment, but it might earn goodwill with West Germany. And Gorbachev needed West German support for his reform agenda. He needed Western economic cooperation. He needed to improve relations with the West. Maybe releasing one teenager could help with that. In December 1987, signals began emerging that the Soviet Union might be willing to reconsider Mathias's sentence. Soviet officials began using phrases like humanitarian considerations and bilateral friendship when discussing the case. West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl picked up on these signals. He authorized his diplomats to intensify negotiations. On August 3, 1988, exactly 1 year after Mathias was convicted, Mikhail Gorbachev signed a decree pardoning him. The decree did not say Mathias was innocent. It did not apologize for his imprisonment. It simply said that in the interests of improving Soviet-German relations, Mathias Rust would be released and deported to West Germany. Mathias learned about his pardon from a camp guard who walked into the furniture factory and told him to pack his belongings. Mathias did not believe it at first. He thought it was some kind of trick. But the guard insisted. "You are being released. Today. Now. Get your things." 2 hours later, Mathias was on a bus heading to Moscow. The next day, he was on a plane to Frankfurt. He had spent 432 days in Soviet custody. 432 days wondering if he would ever go home. And now he was going home. The relief was overwhelming. But so was the realization of what he had lost. 432 days of his life, 14 months, gone. When Mathias landed in Frankfurt on August 4, 1988, he was met by chaos. Hundreds of reporters were waiting at the airport, cameras flashing, questions being shouted. Everyone wanted to know about his flight, about his imprisonment, about whether he regretted what he had done. Mathias was overwhelmed. He had gone from total isolation in a Soviet labor camp to international celebrity in the space of 24 hours. He did not know how to handle it. His first press conference was awkward. Reporters asked if he still wanted to meet Gorbachev. Mathias said yes. They asked if he would do it again, knowing what he knew now. Mathias hesitated. Then he said no. He said the flight had accomplished some of what he wanted. It had drawn attention to the need for peace, but the cost had been too high. 14 months in prison. Humiliation for people who did not deserve it. Diplomatic complications. If he had known all of that in advance, he would have found a different way to make his point. Over the next few years, Mathias struggled to find his place in the world. He was famous. Everyone knew his name. But fame did not translate into a career. He tried various jobs. He worked as a consultant for aviation companies. He did motivational speaking. He wrote a book about his experience, but nothing quite fit. The flight that had made him famous had also defined him. He was Mathias Rust, the guy who landed in Red Square. That was his identity now, whether he wanted it or not. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The country that had imprisoned Mathias ceased to exist. The Iron Curtain came down. The Cold War ended. Historians began examining what had contributed to the Soviet collapse, and Mathias Rust's flight was on the list, not as a primary cause, but as a significant factor. His flight had exposed weaknesses in the Soviet military. It had enabled Gorbachev to purge hardliners who opposed reform. It had demonstrated that the Soviet Union was not invincible. All of that had played a role in accelerating changes that led to the end of communism in Eastern Europe. Mathias had wanted to build a bridge between East and West. He had wanted to promote peace. In a strange way, he had succeeded. Not through the meeting with Gorbachev that he had hoped for, but through the unintended consequences of his flight. He had weakened the Soviet military establishment. He had strengthened Gorbachev's hand in pushing reforms. He had contributed to ending the Cold War. It had cost him 14 months in prison. But maybe, just maybe, it had been worth it. 38 years after Mathias Rust landed in Red Square, I found him living in a small apartment in Hamburg, Germany. He is 57 years old now. His hair is gray. His wire-frame glasses are gone, replaced by contact lenses. He works as a financial consultant. He lives quietly. He rarely gives interviews. But when I asked him about May 28th, 1987, he remembered everything, every detail, every moment, every second of the flight that changed his life and changed history. We sat in his living room drinking coffee. On the wall was a photograph, a small white and blue Cessna 172, sitting on cobblestones in Red Square. Mathias looked at the photograph. That airplane does not exist anymore. The Soviets took it apart piece by piece, looking for secret equipment. They never found any because there was nothing to find. Eventually they destroyed it. But I still have that photograph. I look at it sometimes and I think about how young I was, how naive, how absolutely certain that I could make a difference. I asked him, "Do you regret it?" Mathias was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That is a complicated question. Do I regret spending 14 months in a Soviet labor camp? Yes. Do I regret the embarrassment I caused to people who did not deserve it? Yes. But do I regret trying to do something about a world that seemed determined to destroy itself? No, I was 19 years old. I looked at the news, and I saw two superpowers pointing nuclear weapons at each other. I saw leaders who refused to talk to each other. I saw a world that was one mistake away from extinction. And I thought somebody had to do something. So I tried. Was it stupid? Probably. Was it reckless? Definitely. But at least I tried. I asked him about the Soviet military officers who were fired because of his flight. Did he feel guilty about that? Mathias nodded. I think about them sometimes, especially the younger officers, the radar operators, the pilots. They were just doing their jobs. They were following procedures. The fact that their procedures could not handle a small, slow aircraft at low altitude was not their fault. That was a systemic problem. But they paid the price. Some of them lost careers they had worked decades to build. And I was the reason. That is hard to live with. But there is another side to that story. The Soviet military system was broken. It was rigid, bureaucratic, incapable of adapting to unexpected situations. My flight exposed those weaknesses, and Gorbachev used that exposure to force reforms. He removed hundreds of hardline officers who were opposed to change. He brought in new leadership that was more open to modernization. Did I intend to trigger a military purge? No. But it happened. And in the long run, it probably helped end the Cold War faster. So maybe some good came from it. I asked Mathias if he ever achieved his goal of talking to Gorbachev. He smiled. Not in person, but in 2001 I was invited to a conference in Berlin about Cold War history. Gorbachev was there as a speaker. I introduced myself. Told him I was the pilot who landed in Red Square. He laughed. He actually laughed. Then he said, "You caused me a lot of problems, young man. I had to fire my defense minister because of you. But you also gave me an opportunity to make changes that needed to be made. So maybe I should thank you." We talked for about 20 minutes. He is a remarkable man. Even in his 70s, he had incredible presence. I told him what I had hoped to accomplish with my flight. He said he understood. He said idealism in young people is important. The world needs people who believe they can make a difference, even if their methods are questionable. He smiled when he said that. I think it was his way of forgiving me. I asked Mathias about his life after the flight, after his release from prison, after the fame faded. He sighed. It was difficult. For a few years I was famous. Everyone wanted to hear my story. I did speaking engagements. I wrote a book. I was on television. But fame is exhausting, and eventually people stop caring. The story becomes old news. You become a footnote in history. I struggled with that for a long time. I had defined myself by this one act, this one crazy thing I did when I was 19. And when people stopped caring about it, I did not know who I was anymore. I made some bad decisions. I got into legal trouble in the 1990s. Nothing related to aviation, just stupid personal mistakes. I spent some time in German prison. That was my second time in prison. I seemed to have a talent for ending up behind bars. But eventually I got my life together. I went back to school, got a degree in finance, started working, built a normal life, or as normal as possible for someone who will always be known as the guy who landed in Red Square. I asked if he had stayed in contact with anyone from his experience, any of the Soviet officials, any of his fellow prisoners. Mathias shook his head. No. When I was released, I wanted to put it all behind me. I wanted to forget. Of course, I could not forget, but I tried. I lost touch with everyone from that time. Sometimes I wonder about the guards at the labor camp, the other prisoners, the KGB interrogators. What did they think about the collapse of the Soviet Union? Did they realize that the system they had served was falling apart? Did they question what they had been doing? I will never know. I asked Mathias about the historical significance of his flight. How did he feel knowing that historians now list his flight as one of the factors that contributed to ending the Cold War? He looked at the photograph on the wall again. It is strange. When I took off from Helsinki, I thought I was going to change the world. I thought landing in Moscow and talking to Gorbachev would somehow make peace happen. It did not work out that way. I never got to talk to Gorbachev about peace. I went to prison instead. But the flight still changed things, just not in the way I expected. My flight exposed weaknesses in the Soviet military. It enabled Gorbachev to remove hardliners. It demonstrated that the Soviet Union was not invincible. All of that contributed to changes that eventually led to the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. So I did help end the Cold War. But not because I talked to anyone about peace. I helped end the Cold War by accident, by making the Soviet military look incompetent. That was not my intention. But that is what happened. Does that count as success? I honestly do not know. I wanted to build a bridge. I ended up exposing cracks in a foundation. The bridge came later, built by other people, Gorbachev, Reagan, Kohl, people who actually knew what they were doing. I was just a catalyst, a lucky idiot who stumbled into history. I asked Mathias what he would tell young people today who want to make a difference in the world. He thought for a moment. I would tell them to choose their methods carefully. I was impulsive. I did not think through all the consequences. I just acted. And I was incredibly lucky that I did not get killed. If Soviet air defense had worked properly, I would have been shot down over Estonia. Nobody would remember my name. I would just be a statistic. A foolish kid who died trying something stupid. But I was lucky. I survived. And my survival meant something. It meant that sometimes impossible things are possible. It meant that individuals can make a difference, even when they do not have power or money or connections, even when they are just 19-year-old students with a crazy idea. You can change history if you are willing to take risks, and if you are lucky enough not to die trying. But choose your risks wisely. Think about consequences. Think about who might get hurt. Think about whether there are better ways to accomplish your goals. I did not think about any of that. I just acted, and it worked out. But it could have ended very differently. I do not recommend my approach, but I do recommend the impulse behind it, the belief that you can make a difference, the refusal to accept that the world is unchangeable. Hold on to that. Just be smarter about it than I was. As I was leaving Mathias's apartment, I turned back one more time. The photograph of the Cessna in Red Square was still on the wall. A moment, frozen in time. May 28th, 1987. 7:20 p.m. A small white airplane on cobblestones next to the Kremlin. Proof that one person with enough courage or stupidity or idealism could do the impossible. Mathias saw me looking at the photograph. "You know what I think about most when I see that picture?" he said. "I think about all the people who said it could not be done. The experts who said Soviet air defense was impenetrable. The adults who told me I was being naive. The systems and rules and procedures that were supposed to make what I did impossible. They were all wrong. The experts were wrong, the systems were wrong, and a teenager in a rented Cessna proved it. That is the lesson I take from my flight. Not that I was some kind of hero. Not that I changed the world through wisdom or brilliance, but that sometimes the impossible is only impossible because people believe it is. Soviet air defense was supposed to be perfect, but it was not. The Iron Curtain was supposed to be permanent, but it was not. The Cold War was supposed to last forever, but it did not. All of those impossibilities became possible because people stopped believing they were impossible. So maybe my flight mattered for that reason. Not because of what I accomplished, but because of what I proved. That ordinary people can do extraordinary things. That systems can fail. That certainty is an illusion. That the world can change in ways nobody expects. And that sometimes a 19-year-old kid in a tiny airplane can fly straight through the middle of history and come out the other side alive. Today, there is a small plaque in Red Square. It marks the spot where Mathias Rust landed on May 28, 1987. Tourists take photographs with it. Most of them know the story. Some do not. But the plaque is there. A reminder that once upon a time, a teenager flew from Helsinki to Moscow in a Cessna 172. He embarrassed the Soviet military. He spent 14 months in prison. He helped trigger events that contributed to ending the Cold War. And he survived to tell the story. Mathias Rust is 57 years old now. He lives quietly in Hamburg. He works as a financial consultant. He rarely gives interviews, but on May 28th every year, people find him. Journalists, historians, documentary filmmakers. They all want to know about the flight, about what he was thinking, about whether he has regrets. And every year Mathias tells them the same thing. It was the craziest thing I ever did. It was reckless and dangerous and stupid. But it was also the most important thing I ever did. And if I had to do it over again, knowing everything I know now, I am not sure I would change anything. Because sometimes crazy is exactly what the world needs.